Good morning and welcome to the 14th meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Relations Committee in Session 5. Can I remind members to turn off mobile devices, and any members using electronic devices to access committee papers could ensure that, please, if they were turned to silence. Apologies have been received from Jackson Carlo MSP, who is attending the Scottish Parliament's corporate body this morning and who may come later to the meeting. Our first item of business today is a roundtable session on the implications of the EU referendum for Scotland, and we're focusing today on EU migration. I'd like to welcome all our witnesses who have joined us today, and I think the best way to start off was if we go round the table and introduce ourselves, and we'll start with Stuart McMillan.
Stuart McMillan, MSP for Greenock and Inverclyde.
Christina Boswell, Professor of Politics, University of Edinburgh.
Rachel Hamilton, MSP South of Scotland. Lorraine Cook from COSLA.
Ross Greer, MSP for the West of Scotland.
Colin Wilson from Five Migrants Forum.
Tavish Scott, MSP for Shetland.
Angela Hallam, Strategic Analysis, Scottish Government.
Rebecca Kay, Professor of Russian Gender Studies, University of Glasgow.
Kirsty McLaughlin, National Records of Scotland.
Richard Lochhead, MSP for Murray.
Robert Wright, Professor of Economics, University of Strathclyde.
Em Harper, MSP for South Scotland region.
Lewis MacDonald, MSP for North East Scotland and Deputy Convener.
I'm Joan McAlpine, MSP for South of Scotland, and I'm the convener of the committee. We have been provided with some excellent written research by SPICE, the Scottish Parliament's Information Service. One of the things that certainly struck me was the estimated 181,000 EU nationals who are resident in Scotland, with the majority being from EU accession nations, and that the increase in population between 2000 and 2015 is 5.7% in Scotland, and apparently the increase in Scotland is higher in terms of people born outside the UK. The increase is higher here in that period of time than the rest of the UK. So I think I would like to start off basically asking some of our witnesses to reflect on the impact of that net migration, the impact on Scotland, both the benefits and the challenges of it. Who would like to start off?
Go on,
Yes.
I think in terms of population growth, it's very different, as Kirsty will tell in much more detail, it's very different across different local authority areas. And in terms of attracting people to local areas, population growth is a huge issue for some local authorities, not so much for other local authorities, but we looked at the last single outcome agreements and looked at every local authority's single outcome agreement, and just under half had population growth as one of their key outcomes. So it is hugely important to local authorities, and it's recognised that migration is a key factor within that.
Professor Wright.
I think you have to sort of state some facts to begin with, right? If you look at the population growth in Scotland, it's not immigration or net migration that's driving it. What drives population growth is fertility. Fertility is below replacement level, has been so for 4.5 decades. The Scottish population will not grow much in the future and will not grow rapidly. However, where the immigration comes in is particularly important is that immigrants tend to be younger, and therefore they are more so in the childbearing age group. So this is why we see kind of high fertility amongst immigrants, basically because they're younger. And also, this is what grows the labor force. And this is the key, and this has always been the key since Jack McConnell said you need to grow the population to grow the labor force, because without a growing labor force with the appropriate skills, then you won't get the economic growth that pushes our standard of living up, and has done so for almost all of this century. So I think this discussion of population growth and whether the population of Scotland is going to grow rapidly or slowly or whatever is not the central issue, and it's certainly not an issue that focuses the intentions or sort of interests on the importance of migration to grow the labor force and the implications for Brexit, where if it goes through in the scenario that's most likely, then the free movement of people from these A8 countries will be stopped. And we've got all the numbers from Kirsty, how many people are in those age groups. how many people are in those groups, and their impact on the labor force growth. And this is the key question. What do? You need these people to grow the labor force. Basically, the channel will be closed. Then how do you get these people if you can't get them the way you used to because you have a referendum to decide to leave the EU? So population growth, to me, is not the issue.
Kirsty McLaughlin.
Just to reiterate what Robert says, it is more the kind of age structure of the population which is going to be affected by not having EU migrants. I think I've circulated various charts here, and I think if you look at, well, 3 and 4 look at what would happen if there was, it's an illustrative projection of what would happen if there was no future EU migration. You know, we did a rough approximation of the proportion of in-migrants that were from the EU and then projected for the population. So figure 3 shows what would happen over the next 10 years, and figure 4 shows over the next 25 years. And as Robert says, the impact is really on the kind of younger age group. You know, migrants are quite young, working age, and children. And it's a much greater impact on Scotland than it is on the rest of the UK. You know, UK have got a sort of younger age profile. We've got a lot of baby boomers, fertility is lower. We've all got ageing populations, but it's really the kind of the working age population that it seems to be the one that's going to impact the most.
Can I just come in there just to say something to help this discussion along? Now, these zero net migration projections are very informative, right? So you can think of them 2 ways. The door is shut, nobody leaves, nobody comes, or somehow you can think about the number of people coming equals the number of people leaving, because there's 2 different scenarios. But don't forget, even if you're Nigel Farage, you want to stop immigration, or somebody wants to stop immigration totally to Scotland, right? It doesn't stop people leaving. So these people will leave because they're leaving as well as coming. So we can stop people coming because, if we leave the EU, we have an immigration system that will allow that. But it doesn't stop people leaving Scotland. So these are optimistic projections. They say this story is a good story relative to what it will actually likely be if there's big reductions in immigration. Thank you.
Christina Boswell. I think Christina wanted to come in. I think you were the first. Christina Boswell.
I mean, this might potentially be moving the debate on to policy issues, but I think we've got to premise our discussion on a realistic sense of what the scenarios are, the policy scenarios. So we're talking about this possible scenario of no future EU immigration in the event of a cessation of free movement rights. I find that highly implausible. I think much more likely is that the UK government will have to find ways of preserving, I think largely preserving to some extent the volume and also the composition of current EU flows. And we can discuss what the policy scenarios are for the UK government to do that. But I don't think anybody, even the most rabid Brexiteers, are suggesting that there will be a cessation of flows of EU nationals to the UK. The question is, what will be the post-Brexit policy scenarios, and how might a Scottish government try to influence and shape what those policy scenarios are, what those programmes are, in a way that's most beneficial to Scotland. I mean, I can elaborate on this point, but I just want to inject that sort of policy factor into the debate.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca Kay.
Yeah, I think sort of leading on from that, I understand why a kind of Scotland-wide level and a higher policy level there's interest in makeup of the population and workforce issues particularly. And of course, economic factors also are important to migrants themselves. But I think it's important to recognise that in the actual experiences of people who come to live here and make lives here, there are many other reasons that influence a decision to come here in the first place and a decision to stay longer term, and that those need to be factored into policy responses, both in terms of Brexit negotiations, but also things that can currently be done by the Scottish Government and by local authorities to deal with the uncertainties that Brexit has caused, to look at migrants' lives in the round and what encourages people to come but also encourages them to stay, and that might have a very big influence on factors beyond the actual legislation that says whether or not people can come, but whether people see Scotland as a place they want to come to, and indeed once they're here, whether they see it as a place that they and their children potentially have a future in. And I think there's quite a lot that we could discuss around that.
Okay, thank you. Angela Callum.
I just want
to make a point about what we know about the migrants who are already here. And obviously the best source we've got on that is the census, although now the census data is getting quite old. But the Scottish Government published a report last year on the characteristics of EEA and non-EEA migrants, recent and established. And in October, we published a follow-up which extended that to actually compare them with the Scottish-born population and the rest of the UK-born population. And it's very, very clear to see that recent EEA migrants in particular are much more likely to be in employment or students. So actually, if we're thinking about what our situation is and how those migrants are adding value to the Scottish economy, I think it's useful to actually start with that in mind.
Thank you. And I think we have Lorraine Cook wanted to come in.
Can I just clarify about outcomes and what Robert was saying about population growth? If you unpick these outcomes and look at them in more detail, I said it very broad brush, but really they're looking at working age population, and local authorities are acutely aware of their ageing population and the different makeup and demographics within their local areas. But also picking up on what Rebecca was saying about the importance of, well, the sort of sense of imposed uncertainty that people are living in, and the importance of leadership, and importance of getting that message across. There's been different announcements from chief executives and leaders, and of course Scottish got the First Minister, but just really making sure people know that they are valued, their contribution within the local area, within the country, is valued.
Thank you. Now we have the first question from our member, Rachel Hamilton, MSP.
Actually a point. I agree with what Christina Boswell said, but it was actually a point because we started off looking at how our country would be affected if the doors had been shut from both Professor Wright and Kirsty McLachlan. But I would like to, if you could possibly just describe the graph that you have here about the projected needs for EU migration to enable us to have the population that is required here in Scotland. If that's possible.
Right.
I think, this is your paper?
Yes. Yes.
We started off by looking at how we would be affected if the doors were shut and we didn't have EU migrants coming into Scotland. Does the first graph project what the migration requirements are needed?
Well, not needed, but you're probably better looking at a number 5. Figure 5 shows the principal projection.
Yeah.
So this is the projections that were done, the 2014 base projections, with forgetting about Brexit, and these are the kind of the ones that have been all the assumptions have been tested and checked with expert group and done. ONS carried them out on our behalf. So the principal projection is the one that we reckon is the one that we put most weight on, I suppose. We produce variant projections as well: high fertility, low fertility, high mortality, low mortality, high migration, low migration. So there's lots of variants just to show how uncertain it is the further into the future you go. So the kind of lighter green blobs, the bars there, are what we published earlier in the year before Brexit. This is what our projections would be. And it compares, just looking at the total population one there, we're projecting that for the UK as a whole, total population would grow by 15%, and in Scotland it would be 7%. And then we also show England, Northern Ireland and Wales. So most of the UK growth is from England, the 17%. But that does vary quite a lot. You know, in the age structure, all the different countries in the UK under pensioners, we're all projected to age. The life expectancy is increasing, so there's going to be more pensioners. Where the difference really is, I think, is looking at the number of children under the principal projection and the working age. So under the principal projection for the children, Scotland's projected to increase the number of children by 1%, whereas England's 10%, the UK as a whole is 9%. So there's quite a big difference in the number of children. And then the working age population, Scotland's working age population is projected to increase by 1% over the next 25 years, whereas England's would be 13% and the UK as a whole would be 11%. So it's really this kind of balance, that the age structure that is different, you know, before Brexit came along. That's what we were projecting.
Thank you. Professor Wright wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just want... You know, the understanding of these kind of population dynamics is rather complicated, right? So let me try to think about this and answer this question personally in a different way, right? You look at the situation that we have the most recent data for last year, right? There was 85,000 immigrants coming to Scotland, according to these estimates, right? 47,000, 55% came from the rest of the UK, right? So we have no control over that, right? Let's become an independent country, okay? So you don't have to worry about these people because and 37,000, let's call it 40,000, came from the rest of the world. Of half of that figure came from the UK, right? Or from the EU. So you're looking at kind of 25%. You're going to be missing 25% if the door is shut. Now, I agree with Christine, but I don't agree totally, because it's not so difficult. If you look at what the people from the EU immigrants are actually doing, most of them are in low-skilled jobs, and the UK immigration system has a low-skilled tier that's never been used, Tier 3. And all the rhetoric and discussion we're hearing on television and on the radio is about basically, you know, the system of visas, et cetera. It's just kind of reactivating this tier. And it's not necessarily the case that someone from Poland that would come to work here for 2 years is going to apply for a Tier 3 visa. Right? So these low-skilled people under the post-Brexit system with a Tier 3 may be attracting low-skilled people who actually have low skills from somewhere else. And I do not think, if this Brexit goes through, that we're going to have a lot of Poles with high levels of education doing low-skilled jobs. I do not think this is going to happen, and it shouldn't, because basically what you get is a lot of labor market mismatch, right? You get people high skill and low skill, you get a lot of turnover in the labor market, and this is expensive. Labor market turnover is expensive. You want to try to match people, their skills to the job better. And immigration system in Canada does this. The UK copied that with the points-based system, but never used the Tier 3 because they didn't need to, because they got a lot of low-skilled people who were allowed to live because of the EU arrangement, live, work, and stay here because of the EU arrangements. So I don't know if that's a partial answer, but it's not everybody, but it's an important component of immigration comes currently from the EU, 25%.
There's 2 points there in the briefing that we have, and one is that when the economy is not good, wages are lower, particularly for EU migrants. And the second point is that the migrants that are coming across have, they're almost dumbing down their CVs because they want to get jobs, and they end up in low-skilled jobs. They are much more qualified than they actually are for those jobs.
And there's a cost both to the economy and there's a cost both to the individual about that, because there's a lot of labor market turnover, right?
Thank you. Can I bring in Lewis MacDonald?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in this point, but I think there's a wider point here, and that is around how the system operates currently. And I think it's true to say that many people arrive to do jobs that are lower skilled than their qualifications. But is it not the case, certainly I know in the northeast of Scotland, but I suspect in other urban areas besides Aberdeen, that many people arrive to do relatively low-grade jobs and then very quickly find their way through the labour market into other employment. And I'd be interested to hear the views around the table on that issue. In other words, is there mobility, social mobility within the EU population more generally? I have the sense there is in the area that I represent, but I'm not sure how typical that might be.
I think Professor Key wants to come in.
I think that's very, well, in our research that has appeared to be very varied across different regions of Scotland. So we've done research in Glasgow, Aberdeen, but also Aberdeenshire and Angus. And certainly Aberdeen stood out as an area where there was a relatively kind of attractive labour market, and migrants could upskill more easily, or could work in contexts where they were also able to increase their English language skills and therefore put into practice the qualifications and skills they might have brought with them. And I realise this is being a bit picky, but I'm not sure people come here to take up low-skilled jobs. I think they come here to make a life, and the starting point for that is to accept lower-skilled work. In some areas where we've been working, particularly in the more rural regions, we've found people stuck for a very long time in very unskilled work, not commensurate with their qualifications, not commensurate with their skill set, and actually in a vicious circle where the forms of employment they're engaged in particularly make it very difficult for them to increase their English language skills. So if you're working double shifts in a fish gutting factory, then getting to our language classes, and you're working with a workforce that's almost entirely made up of other Central East Europeans, then the fact that you're in an English-speaking environment does not mean that your English language rapidly increases.
So there are two very different experiences.
There are very different experiences, but those are also replicated. For example, in Glasgow, we've found people with similar experiences who've gone into work that's very dominated by other Central East European migrants and have struggled as part of that.
I see Mr. Wilson from Fife Migrants Forum, you're nodding your head there. Is that something that
resonates
with you?
That's very, very, very true. There's no stereotypical migrant coming into Scotland. They come in for various and numerous reasons. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as somebody comes over to spend a few weeks with a friend and decides they like what they see and would maybe start in a low-paid job. But many of the migrants that we have are capable of doing a lot more than the jobs that they're in at present, and they're ambitious, and when they do get a knowledge of their environment, they want to move on and want to move into higher skilled jobs. And I think that's a great thing. I think it's great for the economy. I mean, just in the last year or so, if we take, for example, Kirkcaldy, where I work from, we saw a high street that was just dying, just totally dying. And now we've got probably 7, 8 businesses that have been set up by migrants that have arrived in Fife, employing not a lot of people, but providing employment.
Sorry, can I just follow up those points briefly? Is there evidence then, given what you've described about people in a rural poverty trap, essentially, migrant labour, is there evidence of gangmasters employing people at illegally low wages below the national minimum wage? And is there evidence of illegal migration from Eastern European countries out with the EU coming through EU channels?
Evidence of gangmasters, and we've had a few cases recently of this being organised from one of the East European countries, and providing employers with low-paid employees and exploiting those employees. We've seen evidence of wages being paid or not paid through European banks to workers. I mean, it seems to be more prevalent at the moment than it has been for a while.
And illegally so.
Illegally, yeah.
Illegally,
yeah. We've looked less at questions about gangmasters or illegal migration or irregular migration status, but certainly we've found a huge variance in the ways in which employers treat their workers, and that has an enormous knock-on effect for people's ability, including to progress. So for migrants themselves, working on a farm where somebody's paying wages irregularly, providing very low standard accommodation, not facilitating transport within a region where public transport might be difficult, is very different from the experience of someone working on a farm or in a food processing factory that's providing decent accommodation, making a big effort to help people to integrate with other workers from different countries, and so on and so on. So even where there might be completely legal kind of working arrangements, that borderline between a good employer and a less good employer can be very significant.
Robert Wright.
Sort of get back to this other question about what some people call social mobility, moving up the occupational ladder. I mean, there's a lot of evidence out there. I mean, for example, from the census, even though it's 5 or 6 years old now, I mean, there's a big skill mismatch between education level and what EU migrants are doing. It's huge. There's a lot of variability and a lot of regional variation, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But that is kind of just numbers, and that can be commented on. The other thing is there's very little evidence that there's significant social mobility amongst this group. In fact, if you look at Ireland, that have done a lot of research in this area, there isn't any hardly at all, and a lot of people return to where they come, the country they came from because of this. And this, of course, was a choice of a lot of EU migrants in Ireland with the recession when it hit really hard there, right? So it is not the case that somehow they get here and they take these low-skilled jobs because that's all they can get. Of course, they have aspirations, but those aspirations for the vast majority of these people, at least what the data says, are not realized. And what do? Well, they're stuck in these jobs, as you call it, the poverty trap or whatever you want to call it, or they return home. And of course, when they return home or where they're from or whatever you want to call it, we can't ask them questions because we don't have any information on them, right? So we're guessing about them. So the only way to really get a handle on a lot of these issues is to kind of collect information on social mobility and then collect information about people that return to the country where they came from, which seems not likely to happen on a large scale.
Angela Hallam.
I was going to make firstly the point that Robert just made about from the census that we know that EU accession migrants are very different in terms of the types of jobs they're in, and that the census actually breaks down by degree level qualifications, whether people are in managerial posts or semi-routine or routine occupations, and the EEA accession migrants there's a massive difference between them and all the other groups. So they're very likely to be in low-skilled jobs. So we've got the evidence that says that, as Robert made the point. But I also wanted to flag up the impacts, the review of the impacts of migrants and migration into Scotland, which was published in October. And that found that there's a U-shaped pattern in wages for EU migrants. So there's a real cluster at the low skill end, but there's also a cluster at the high skill end and not much in between. And I think the point that Rebecca was making about Aberdeen is a case of what Aberdeen obviously is quite a mixed environment, but there's some very high skilled jobs in the oil industry. There may not be so many going forward, but so I just wanted to make that point.
Right. Christina.
I wanted to point out, building on this discussion on social mobility, that one of the clear risks of Brexit, I think, is that will further limit options for social mobility of EU nationals and potentially enhance vulnerability to exploitation, because obviously if you don't have the full panoply of rights associated with free movement, you're more likely to enter through some of the more rigid schemes, such as, for example, a Tier 2, which is linked to particular occupations and jobs, or perhaps a Tier 3 or a seasonal labour scheme where you have really quite limited rights and a very fixed term period of employment. So I think that's one of the clear changes, so that even if post-Brexit we do see an attempt to preserve existing volume and composition of flows from the EU, which I think is likely, we will see much more vulnerability, especially of low-skilled workers, but also more rigidity, I think, in schemes for recruiting higher-skilled workers.
I think it would probably be helpful for our record if somebody could explain the tier system. Who would like to volunteer to do that?
I mean, yeah. I mean, there are 5 tiers. The ones which I think are most relevant to a post-Brexit scenario are Tier 2, which is a range of different programmes, including intra-company transfers, the occupational shortage list. So that's a definition of the occupations which face acute shortages. And there is a special list for Scotland, but it's very minimally used. But I think this is very important to think about Tier 2, because I would imagine that one obvious route for trying to perhaps expand possibilities for recruitment of EU nationals post-Brexit within the tier system would be to expand Tier 2. And there's an opportunity for Scotland to try to identify particular occupations or sectors which will face acute shortages and which need to preserve a flow of EU nationals into those occupations. Now, Tier 2 tends to be skilled or highly skilled. Tier 3 is low skilled but has not been activated since the points-based system was set up because of EU enlargement, which is seen to fill the requirement for low skilled migration. There's also a temporary, Tier 4 is temporary, Tier 5 is temporary migrants. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And I think debates at the moment, for example, there was a House House of Commons debate on seasonal agricultural workers at the end of November. You might have followed this. I think, again, there's likely to be a move to try to expand seasonal worker schemes post-Brexit, precisely to fill these shortages which will emerge as a result of stopping free movement. And I think, again, we're going to expect to see very strong lobbies from affected sectors. There's already a kind of mobilisation of the agricultural lobby to try to put in place some sort of replacement scheme. So generally, we could see an expansion of the tier system. We could also see bespoke programmes or systems put in place specifically for EU nationals, which give them preferential treatment. So I think those are two scenarios which are most likely to emerge. I think less likely is a points-based system. I think fresh talent is a potential scenario, because I think there will also be an interest in providing incentives for EU students to continue to come to UK universities. So I really think we have to consider the full range of possible options for post-Brexit immigration schemes and not be too fixated on the points-based system and fresh talent, but look at the occupational and sector-based schemes as well.
Professor Kay.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on this question around seasonal workers and link it back to my previous point about, of course, the economy and the labour force is important, but it's not the whole picture. And I think that also links to what Lorraine was saying earlier about particular local authorities for whom outcome agreements around population growth and the demographic structure of populations are important. So Angus, one of the places we've been working, is clearly a region that has a lot of need for seasonal workers. But what's happened for EU migrants, and what we found a lot of evidence for in what, albeit is a qualitative piece of research, is people who come over for seasonal work repeatedly and then stay and actually begin to develop a practice of permanent residents in Angus moving between different kinds of seasonal work and accessing the social rights they have as EU citizens in periods where there might be a gap in their employment. So actually we found a lot of people who may spend the spring picking daffodils, the summer working on the berries, the autumn lifting potatoes, and the winter working in packaging and so on around the Christmas season. And those people bring families with them and have children, and Professor Wright's point about fertility rates and the higher fertility rates amongst migrant populations plays in there. So that a tiered system that is very much focused on the needs of the labour market ignores those extra wider issues about the migrant population and what the migrant population may be bringing to particular areas beyond narrowly defined labour market needs, but actually looking more broadly at demographic profiles, communities. There are communities where primary schools have 50% and above of their intake years the children of Central East European migrants. What happens to those schools and those communities if those families are not there?
Professor Wright.
The other is Tier 4, which is the student one. So the EU, post-Brexit EU students could be considered under that tier and whatever arrangements you want to make. You know, one of the things I find sort of surprising is that you have this point-based immigration system, right? And what this will allow you to do is allows you to, you know, on the sort of economic side, match people to jobs, right? That's what the whole thing is about, more or less. You know, there's other forms of immigration, refugees, family unification, you list them out, that's fine, but they're not part of that system. But why is everybody so concerned that, you know, in the future, it may not be someone from Poland doing these low-skilled jobs. It may be somebody from Indonesia. It may be somebody from somewhere else. It should be the best person that has the appropriate skills to do that job. So post-Brexit, I hate to say this, may give you an opportunity to put in a more rational immigration system that does a better job of matching people to jobs and reduce job turnover. We are not in a situation where we can discriminate. We shouldn't discriminate on country of origin. This is why they put these points-based systems in place to begin with, because they wanted to get away from this form of discrimination and they wanted to attract people with the best suited skills, so they widened the net. So it's about what, I don't agree with Christine. I think these, in the future, whatever system's in place, it will stop this high-skilled immigration from A8 to Scotland, to the UK, to take up low-skilled jobs, and so be it. The challenge is to say, well, where do we get these people that we need from? And how are we going to do this in a country like Scotland that has no say in immigration policy, but we have a points-based system in place? And I think that's a challenge, and it's also an opportunity. And the current system we've got a little bit lazy about because we don't know how to do anything, right? It's because people would note that these jobs are there, and they would show up, and they have very high skills, English language mainly, largely, and we just continue on. And we've taken this for granted, and now we have to think about what we're going to do if that's not available.
Lorraine Cook.
I think our fear is around the points-based system is it's a system that's focused on restriction and reducing migration. I mean that is its primary focus, and our issue has been the lack of flexibility. So I mean, we've got a lot of different examples of points-based systems in Canada, for example, but in the UK it doesn't seem to have, yes, we have the Scottish Shortage Occupation List, and as Christina says, I think there's a couple of occupations on it, but we have that lack of flexibility to reflect Scotland's needs and local areas' needs. So that would be our issue. And in terms of a system that is creating more barriers, if you like. So if we look at the Shortage Occupation List, and the bar has rose throughout the years. So if we look at social care. So before there was social care on it, but qualifications and such like salary scales have risen, so that has come out of the tier 2. So that would be our issue in terms of that lack of flexibility and that focus on reduction and reducing migration in general. But going back to Becca's point as well about the importance of the wider benefits that people bring with them. We were responding to the Migration Advisory Committee, and it was about impact on services. That was what their inquiry was about, and we sent out to local authorities, and I have to say it was overwhelmingly positive. There are some English as additional language in schools. There are obviously some issues. I'm not saying there's not, but there was a lot of the feedback we were getting was about the benefits that people were bringing with them, and in terms of the example Becca gave about small schools that remain open because of migrant families.
We have another question from Stuart McMillan.
It's some of the latter comments, but the question's mainly aimed to Professor Wright with your comments a few moments ago. Do you think that there's a possibility that certainly post-Brexit within the UK that there could be or should be a differentiation in terms of immigration policy then?
You said this, so yes, of course. I mean, it's, you can have shared responsibility for immigration. I mean, Australia, Canada have had this for decades, right? It's a matter of just political agreement, not technology, right? So again, but I don't see the probability of that happening, increasing or decreasing with Brexit, because this has been clearly stated just the other day. This is not going to happen, right? And let's not get too carried away with this occupation list that Christine mentioned, and she's correct, because it's out of date as soon as it's published. It's just a distraction away from the real issues of how do we attract the people that we need. I mean, we know who they are. We don't need a list to read from. But again, no, I don't think this changes anything with respect to the Scottish situation, with respect to having further responsibility about immigration. It's just that means that we have to pay more attention to how to plug the gap that's, I think, is going to result when the door is shut to the rest of the EU.
Sorry, but I have a different view of this. I think that it's inevitable that UK immigration policy will be in flux in the context of Brexit. Something is going to have to change, whether it's an expansion of the existing points-based system or new bespoke programmes. And the reason I emphasise occupational or sectoral shortages is not because I think this is a wonderful, ideal scenario of immigration policy. It's very rigid, and it doesn't take into account the wider set of factors that are of concern in the Scottish policy-making context. It's a more pragmatic consideration that I suspect, based on the record of the current government and the previous Labour government as well, there is, let's say, a fixation with labour market shortages and systems which define migration needs based on acknowledged shortages in particular occupations or sectors. That's why I think this is an opportunity for the Scottish Government to get better data on where those shortages are, so that, pragmatically in negotiations it can have some leverage to try to secure a more more generous model or programme which better suits Scottish needs, which would be better than a highly restrictive approach, which substantially reduces EU immigration flows.
Angela Hallam.
I just wanted to flag up that the Scottish Government is doing work to look in greater depth at the sectors that EU migrants are working in, and to get better data, better coordinated data about that. And obviously, some of that data is quite difficult to get. Quite a lot of data we get through the annual population survey. We've got a lot of census data, and we're digging deeper into that. But obviously, a key area is agriculture. And there's difficulty getting a handle on that, but our colleagues in rural policy are investigating agricultural census, and they're commissioning more work to actually look at the agricultural sector and get a better grip on the contribution of seasonal migrants.
Is that likely to be ready, do you know?
I can report back to the committee on the research. The research I mentioned will be starting next year, and I think it's reporting in 2018, but I can check on that. But the better sectoral analysis is going on at the moment. And we have some annual population survey analysis, which I can share with the committee later on. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I think we would really appreciate that. Rachel Hamilton?
With what Christina Boswell says about the evidence that we need to look at sectorial importance, because we've had a lot of people coming here from different sectors who have expressed a need for EU migrants in their sectors, particularly agriculture. But I wanted to ask Angela Hallam, we've got some information here based on figures from ONS, and it basically says that we all know that the hotel and restaurant industry has a great need for EU migrants within the sector, and it's about a third of the current workforce. However, these figures don't suggest that agriculture, forestry and fishing sector is considered statistically robust to include within these figures. And I find that surprising, considering the research that Professor Kay has done, saying that it is of so much importance, and of the evidence that we have gathered here within this committee.
I think obviously there is a great difficulty getting a handle on the agricultural system, because migrants are coming and going and migrating from job to job as the season progresses. But colleagues in rural actually looked at the agricultural census, and which records the number of days that people are doing, but not the number of actual workers that there are. And their estimate came out as somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000. So that's why we obviously need better work to actually address this, and that's in hand.
Robert Wright.
Sort of this, you need EU migrants for this. I don't understand this statement. You have vacancies, you have jobs that are not being filled by Scottish people or people from the rest of the UK. They need to be filled by somebody. It's not a need for EU migrants, it's a need for someone to do the work, right? And that's the way you should think about it. Because I think that in the future, you can't take it for granted that it will be an EU migrant. So you have to think about, well, what can we do to fill that vacancy? Not what do we do to keep EU migrants coming to Scotland. It's very different. And this is, I think you have to start thinking these ways if this Brexit thing goes through as, kind of a lot of us believe will. Because that's the problem. The work needs to be done by somebody. And domestically, we don't have the people, or the people don't want to do that work.
Professor Key.
Just to pick up on that point, and I don't disagree with the fact that it shouldn't in some ways matter to Scotland whether it's Polish people or Indonesian people coming to do the work, but I would like to once again iterate that migrants are more than economic units, and if the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government are going to have a joined up policy approach to migration, if we're going down a policy approach that says, well, we use the tier-based system and we bring people from wherever they may be to do the jobs. What do we do with them once they're in the country, and what other policies are required to properly accommodate their lives in the country? What does that mean for example, the demographic profile of the country? If someone from Poland, because of its proximity, because of transport, because of EU further social rights that have allowed them to bring dependents and family with them, have actually embedded in communities, have had an impact on fertility rates, have kept schools open, where someone from Indonesia is much more likely to come as a single worker and not be able to form those sorts of ties, or would be able to, but that would require other policies to be structured around it than just a labour market.
That's just not factually correct in a place like the United States or Canada, right? They set the hurdle really high to immigrate, right? So people that want to immigrate, commit to go, and they stay. The return on migration from Canada and the United States is very low because the hurdle's so high to come. Someone from Poland comes for 3 weeks, is disappointed, and goes home. That's.
Well, no, many people from Poland come for 3 weeks and stay for 10 years.
That's right, but it's clearly the case that what we know about return migration, is much higher amongst this group than, people that, for example, go from Malaysia and Philippines to work in the health sector in Canada. So the numbers are there. So how do we square that with your opinion?
Malcolm Wilson.
I think why migration has worked for the agriculture, taken for example the agricultural industry in Scotland, is because it's simple. Because a farmer can get the employees that he requires for a week, for a month, for a year. It's simple. It doesn't take any sort of working with governments, working with officialdom or anything like that. There, migrants flow in, flow out. It just fills jobs. And if I take, for example, some of the employees in Fife, I mean, they tell me over and over again that their businesses just wouldn't exist if it weren't for migrants. And I don't think that farmers in Fife or whatever are going to be. If it's complex and if it's difficult to employ employees from the Philippines or wherever you want to, then businesses will go to the wall. It works now because it's simple. That's my view.
Professor Boswell.
Just a point about the probability or desirability of EU as opposed to other non-EU nationals occupying these temporary or seasonal migration schemes. I mean, look, the experience in Europe is that it's typical for countries to have bilateral agreements with neighbouring countries, and traditionally it's been Central East European countries, North African countries, and so on, to fill seasonal temporary labour migration needs. And I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be the case, and it has been the case under the SAWS, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme in the UK, for example. So, I mean, there are many reasons why it's more convenient to have these sorts of agreements with neighbouring countries where there are established patterns of pendular or circular migration, established migrant networks, and not least it might be part of a package of a political, in a political context, a package of agreements with countries such as Poland and other countries which have been typical sending countries for lower skilled employment. So I think that's highly likely to continue, that pattern. Whether it's ideal or not from an economic point of view, I think that's likely to continue. And I mean, our research that we carried out some years ago on Polish and Romanian migration showed how these mobilities are very pendular, that people in a particular locale in countries of origin tend to rely on these forms of temporary migration to sustain local livelihoods, and it's often a kind of family strategy if a member of the family goes and takes up, say, 6 months seasonal agricultural work in an EU country. I think with high-skilled migration as well, there is a likelihood that we will see similar two-way agreements. For example, I think the UK government will have every interest in preserving the possibility of UK nationals to go and work in high-skilled jobs in Germany, for example, and I can imagine that being the object of a bilateral agreement. So I think there are strong political and also economic and cultural reasons why EU migrants may well be the preferred or inevitable sort of group which will continue to occupy these types of jobs.
Angela Hallam.
I just wanted to make a point about agriculture. The labour market in general is obviously very subject to the state of the economy. and migrants are a flexible source of workers during a strong economy. But when there's a recession, obviously there's fewer jobs around. However, agriculture is a constant, and it has a constant need for migrants.
I'm aware there's a couple of members who haven't had the opportunity to ask a question yet, so I'm going to Richard Lockhead first.
Thank you very much. And the evidence so far has been fascinating. And I have to say, however, that I do note the confidence that many of you have that some pragmatic solution will be reached in terms of addressing any gap left by EU immigration being reduced, given that for me the defining issue, particularly south of the border of the Brexit referendum, was immigration, and therefore politics south of the border will no doubt overtake the pragmatism that many of the witnesses today seem to think will be put in place, but we'll see what happens. I'm really struck by the startling statistics in figure 5 of the paper before us. I'm not sure many people in Scotland appreciate that the projections between 2014 and 2039 show that the number of children are set to increase by 10% in England compared to a reduction of 5% in Scotland. And in terms of working age population, that category would increase by 13% in England and go down by 3% in Scotland. So apologies, the increase by 1% for working age population in Scotland, increase by 13% in England. There's no equivalent statistic for reduction post-Brexit for England. So that's a startling difference. If you look at the working age population, just to repeat that so we get accurate, a 13% increase in England and a 1% increase in Scotland. So that's a massive difference. And I guess my question is, in the context of the importance of immigration that's led to those projections or will influence those projections, there must be other factors, or is immigration and attracting people from overseas going to have a huge influence on these statistics?
Kirsty McLachlan, you're responsible for these figures. Do you want to start off?
Yeah. Well, the projections, the 3 assumptions that go into it are fertility, mortality, life expectancy, and migration. And for Scotland, most of the increase is through migration because we've got lower fertility. And the age structure of the population, I think England has got a younger age structure. So we're ageing faster in a way than they are, because we seem to have proportionately more baby boomers, people born in the sort of 50s and 60s.
Can I just come in there? Yeah, as I said before earlier, this is kind of complicated to understand why you have these population dynamics. But there is this thing called population momentum. Population change is very slow. Demographic change is very slow. So what Richard has highlighted, has been known for some time, right? That we're looking, basically the population momentum in Scotland is for decline in population and decline in population growth. But the momentum in the UK is for low growth and much higher growth in younger age groups. But if you look at the older population, say, I'll include myself, 55 and above, right? There's not a big deal of difference between the UK, which is basically England, that's biggest, and Scotland. But where the difference is in young people. So if you're, the higher education sector is in for a bit of a shock, and the experienced one, and the labour force, because the labour force really is only growing in Scotland because you have more workers coming than leaving. The net migration of those people in that age group is positive. So it's critical. Now, how can we say, well, let's just say we're not going to have this opportunity to bring people in the future, or the situation changes now and we don't want to make the points-based system more rational or something like this? Well, I mean, the thing is you can increase participation of people. That's a possibility, right? You still have kind of low participation rates amongst women here compared to many other countries, so that would generate more workers, et cetera. There's lots of other things. You can have education system that moves away from higher education to further education to more skills, and there's lots of there's 4 or 5 other things you can do besides immigration. But the bottom line here is, research that I've done and most other people that are economists, is that without the immigration, it's really going to be tough for these other policies, right, to fill the gap. So it's a multi-pronged approach. But this demography that we're looking at in these diagrams is being determined over 4 or 5 decades. It's not going to change. So this is what we're in for, right? So it's known in a way. What isn't known is how much the labour force is going to grow, if at all.
Professor Boswell.
To respond to the point about the scenario of the UK not being able to restrict EU immigration significantly, and that's very much based on the experience since 2010. So the current government has been committed to reduce net migration since 2010. What has been the trend for non-EU immigration? A rise of net migration. So it has rolled out a panoply of measures to try to restrict non-EU immigration since 2010 and has spectacularly failed to restrict that immigration. I don't think there's any grounds for thinking it will be better equipped to restrict EU immigration. Liberal democracies find it very difficult to restrict immigration when it's beneficial to the economy.
Can I have the next question?
Yeah.
I should for the record say, of course, the projection for children in Scotland is to go up by 1% by 2039 compared to 10% for England, and the reduction of 5% projection for children in Scotland is post-Brexit, but there's not an equivalent post-Brexit figure for England, so it would be interesting to get that in the future. But my follow-up question was going to be, many people who voted Leave, for instance, will say that, don't worry, if people are not going to come from Europe to work and live in Scotland, people can come from the rest of the world to live and work in Scotland. And that's a big issue in NHS, for instance, where if you say to people, we rely on EU staff in our hospitals, they'll say, don't worry, those places will be filled by non-EU inward immigration or migration. So it's just to ask, in light of Professor Boswell's comment, is that the case? Is it going to be really easy to replace EU inward migration with non-EU inward migration?
Very complex question and would need some unpacking. I mean, as I've said, I suspect that there will be an attempt to try to preserve existing EU flows. I mean, it's possible that in the medium to long term, those flows, the supply will actually reduce because currently quite a large proportion of EU immigration is from the southern EU countries affected by austerity policies. And I suspect that in the over the next 5 to 10 years, actually, the level of intra-EU flows is actually going to decline, and that we will see a gradual replacement by non-EU immigration. Now, whether it's going to be easy to attract non-EU immigrants to the UK, including Scotland, is a very complex question, and it partly depends on how the Scottish economy is doing, existing networks and communication flows, as well as obviously how attractive the types of packages that are offered are, and what the competition is with other economies who are trying to attract similarly skilled migrants. So I think it's very difficult to answer that question. Perhaps one of our other colleagues wants to talk about some of the levers that can be put in place to try to attract immigrants to Scotland. There are a number of soft levers. But I would have thought that the package that's offered, the package of rights and entitlements that's offered as part of a migration scheme would be influential, certainly.
The long-term population projections, these are these ones that Kirsty put together. I mean, they assume that international migration will not be, EU migration will be zero in the long term, right? Net migration from the EU countries. You know, so there's an implicit assumption that these people will come from, immigrants will come from somewhere else. So it's kind of built in, but I mean, a person is a person. It doesn't, it doesn't highlight this, but the general view is, and I sat on the committee at ONS that set these assumptions for the national projections, and that's what we assumed, right? So we're not. And I think the real issue, I'll just say that I think an important issue is a moral issue. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again to this audience, is that should we be going into Poland and stripping out the youngest and the brightest to come and work in Scotland? We are currently in an economic relationship with them, right? These economies are growing, they're aging more rapidly than ours, right? And it's not like they have a surplus of workers. So we are harming, and I believe harming, our colleagues that we're supposed to be in an economic relationship with. And think about according to these numbers I have, just, 25,000 people, right? The global population is 8.3 billion, right? So the potential supply of immigrants to come to Scotland out there is infinitely inelastic. We need 25,000 people from 8.3 billion. Is that a big challenge? Should we be going into Poland and getting these people, or should we be going farther afield to tap into this huge stock of people that would want to come here, We know that. And the other thing to remember about this change, you have managed immigration with the points-based system, and you have unmanaged because of the EU agreements. So the government is trying to reduce net migration by pushing down immigration. You don't know the counterfactual, what happens if they didn't have that policy in place, and then at the same time we see immigration from the EU rising. Well, it's hardly surprising. It's like a teeter-totter. You push down one side, the other side goes up. One's controlled, one's not controlled. The only way you're going to reduce immigration and net migration is if you have control of all potential sources of immigrants. But yeah, I don't know why the government said they could do this with that type of system they have in place, and it's failed, as Christine said.
Ross Greer, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. We've been quite understandably talking so far almost entirely in terms, talking about EU citizens almost entirely in terms of their labour, what they can contribute to the economy, but these are individuals whose rights are currently at risk, and I'd be quite interested in knowing, because we've touched on emigration as well as inward migration. I think Professor Wright was the first to touch on it. I'd be quite interested in hearing from Colm Wilson and anyone else who has any evidence of what the feeling is amongst existing EU migrant communities in Scotland, the people who are already here. Do many of them expect that they will still be here in the coming years, or are people beginning to think that they might want to return either home or to any of the EU 27 countries?
I think the beauty about the European Union is that we stop talking about national borders and we start looking at people. And the beauty is this flow and ebb of migrants and people from all different cultures mixing with one another and enjoying one another's company. And that's been one of the great things about Scotland, that these people from the rest of Europe feel that they're being accepted here. I was down in Manchester recently. I mean, the mood down there is totally different. There's a fear amongst migrants and the rest of the UK. Scotland, well, and Fife anyway, and I suppose that speaks for the rest of Scotland, there's not this fear amongst migrants that suddenly they're all going to be put on boats and sent back to Poland or whatever.
That's kind of what I was hoping for. I think there's been a broad political consensus in Scotland to try and make that message as clear as possible. And it's worked. That's exactly what I was hoping for.
Encouraging. Professor Kay.
I'd like to pick up on a few of these points. And one is Christina Boswell's point about soft levers and what would encourage people to come, but also indeed what would encourage people to stay, because Scotland does seem to have a consensus, not just that we want people to fill temporary gaps in the labour market, but that certainly in some local authority areas we want people to settle and to stay and to make Scotland their home. And this is not just my opinion, this is based on quite extensive qualitative research, albeit qualitative research into the experiences of people that are here, that show that the social rights that were available through the EU made a big difference to that. And it goes back to my question about if we are having people coming from Indonesia or some other part of the world, what social forms of support and what kinds of policies for integration, what sorts of accompanying packages around family migration, around settlement, around access to education and healthcare would be needed by those people from different places, which may or may not be the same as those that have currently been available to EU migrants. But I think that's something that would need to be looked at in the round as these policies are discussed, and not done as an afterthought once people are already here and we find that it doesn't fit neatly with what might already be in place or indeed might not be in place. To pick up on the point about the intentions of EU migrants who are currently here, and I would certainly agree that many people have been positively influenced by the political leadership within Scotland, by the different message that is being given in Scotland. I do think there's an importance to avoid complacency in Scotland, that this is simply a better place for people to be. Actually, many Scottish areas have a much more recent experience of multiple, multicultural, diverse communities within them, which lower some of the community level interactions and community level networks that people can access when they're living in Scottish places. Certainly there's not been the spike in hate crime reported, but anecdotally people have reported discomfort, problems for their children at school, albeit at a much lower level. I think the other thing to bear in mind is this assumption about whether people will or won't go home is not as straightforward as that. So for many people, the path home is not an easy one. If you've lived in Scotland for the last 5 to 6, 7, 8 years, you have perhaps a Scottish partner, you have a child maybe born in Scotland, whether or not they're with a Scottish partner or another Polish partner. You have no property left available to you in a Central East European country. That economy is not an easy one to go back into. So people may remain without necessarily feeling particularly comfortable about remaining, and the repercussions of the loss of their social lives, social rights, are likely to play out at local authority level rather than necessarily at national level. So I think there's a whole sort of mosaic, a maze of policy making and of policy actors that need to be involved in looking at these potential outcomes and thinking about what they will actually be. And I would very much pick up on Ross Greer's point about treating people as people and not as economic units in order to understand that policy landscape.
There's quite a bit of evidence out there on people's intentions to stay or not stay. And that's, and it's very soon. Yeah, I know it doesn't matter, but it's always, there's very low reporting of people that stayed for a long time. And there's other countries that have policies in place that kind of answer, that respond to some of your issues. So we just have to learn from the experience of others. And I mean, I think it's an exaggeration to say that Scotland is more positive. I just think they're less negative than the rest of the UK. If you look at these surveys and stuff, it's they're all sort of below 50%, but they're just higher than usually what's reported in England. So saying that this is a country that is really positive towards immigration with the man and woman on the street, I think is a major exaggeration. It's still negative, but less negative than other parts of the UK.
Emma Harper.
In my previous background, I was an economic migrant in California, working with nurses, doctors from South America, Africa, Indonesia, whatever, So obviously the post-Brexit, there needs to be an immigration policy that needs to be changed so that we can accommodate skilled people, which are, people from all over the world, for our older population. And we need GPs, we need nurses, we need carers. So I'm interested in clarity on what tier do they come under, or what has to happen post-Brexit to, I guess, address our immigration. What does it need to look like?
Professor Boswell.
I mean, in the case of health professionals, it could come under an expanded occupational shortage list under Tier 2, as we've discussed. Or one could imagine learning from other countries, such as, there's the example of, for example, sectoral-based schemes where you identify particular sectors or occupations as particularly in need of labour, and then you allow people with the relevant qualifications to enter the country and seek work within that sector. For example, the German Green Card scheme of 2000, where an SPD Green government decided to expand opportunities for ICT specialists coming to Germany, and they had to show that they had particular qualifications, and then they could look for work on the German labour market. Now, that kind of scheme is a bit more flexible than a occupational shortage type scheme where you have to have a particular job offer. Okay, so there's a type of scheme where the employer has to meet certain criteria, i.e. this is an occupation which has been identified as facing acute shortages, and then is able to recruit from overseas for a specific job. And then there's a more flexible system where you say people in this sector or this occupation can come here to look for, can have a permit to look for work in this sector. So those are two possible ways of trying to address sectoral shortages. Obviously, you also have more flexible, on the spectrum of flexibility, the most flexible you can have is a human capital-based system where you simply say, and this is more similar to the Canadian, Australian points-based system, where you say, if you accrue a certain number of points based on your qualifications or your other sorts of characteristics associated with your human capital, then you can simply enter and look for any job. And I think the risks of those is that it is more susceptible to de-skilling. And then there are also issues around whether you can have a devolved arrangement for any of these systems, and that raises various issues around retention and whether once people have stayed for a certain period of time and have accrued permanent residency rights, for example, whether there's a concern that then they would leave and relocate to other parts of the country and so on. But there are a range of options that could be explored, and I do think they need to be explored, yes.
I wonder if I could just pick up on that point. When we took evidence in the committee a few weeks ago from the Secretary of State for Scotland, David Mundell, he touched on the issue of different immigration needs in different parts of the country. He didn't suggest that Scotland would have its own immigration system, but he did acknowledge that different parts of the country had different immigration needs. Would it be possible to design a system for Scotland without it being an independent country?
And I think, as Rob already indicated, such models do exist in Australia, in Canada, and I think there has been quite a lot of debate on the idea of a devolved points-based system. That I think, I mean, even actually in the context of the Brexit referendum, if you'll recall, Michael Gove actually wrote a letter to the First Minister suggesting that in the event of Brexit, Scotland could then have a similar kind of devolved regional points-based system. It does appear that the Theresa May's government is less favourable to that kind of devolved approach. Obviously, the Fresh Talent Initiative was an example of a devolved policy that could be explored again, and I know there are moves to try to reinstate that. And then I think the third precedent within the UK would be the Scottish Occupational Shortage List, where, at least in principle, there is leverage for Scotland to identify additional occupations facing acute shortages. So again, that's a possible devolved scheme. Yes.
We had a discussion about this when we visited London, and we spoke to London Assembly members, and there's quite a lot of work being done in London about the idea of a London visa. Now, their issues are different from ours in that they don't. We've got this big demographic issue, but one of the things that came out of those discussions is because we're moving to income tax powers in Scotland, we actually know who's living and working in Scotland. So in a way, we're even better placed to set up our own Scottish system than they would be in London.
Two other quick points on that. So one is that, yes, I think that, obviously there are practical issues associated with those sorts of schemes, but I think they are, they can be overcome. Just to point out, the Swiss have a cantonal-based scheme where cantons have quotas in place and then can bid. There's then a kind of free pool which can be allocated across cantons. So that's another scheme that perhaps could be looked at. But just one final point, which is that for so long as the UK government retains a net migration target, obviously it's going to have a overarching goal of trying to reduce immigration across the UK. So one of the priorities, I think, would be to improve the data, allowing us to develop robust data about net migration to Scotland and to other areas of the UK, because I think once we have that in place, it will be more politically viable to say, yes, England or parts of the UK are seeing a reduction in net migration. In Scotland it's steady or perhaps slightly increasing, but that's Scotland, so that need not be as politically compromising to the Conservative government.
Right. Angela Hallam, did you want to? Oh, sorry, Lorraine Cook. Yeah.
Just going back to the flexibility or Scotland having its own points-based system, and something Becca raised about the importance of a holistic view of an immigration system that also takes into consideration wider rights as well. So if we're looking at the visa system, there has been an erosion of rights in terms of access to health, access to different services. So it is still crucial to look at it in a more holistic way, as well as very much labour shortages. So hand in hand.
Angela.
Yes, I just wanted to make a quick point about the impacts of migration review identified that actually we need better information, but actually, we've got quite good information sources, and Kirsty may want to comment on this because I know that NRS have done a lot of work on improving data sources, but the important thing is making better use of the data we've got and extending that to collect the information that we actually need. I don't know if you want to make.
Can I bring in Kirsty just at that point?
Yeah. Just the source of the information for the moves to the rest of the UK, we're dependent on GP registration. We don't have a population system here in Index, so we have to rely on the kind of moves of GPs to actually record people moving cross-border. What we are doing to try and improve the data sources is using administrative sources. So, trying to get access to data. You have no idea how difficult it is to get access to things like DWP and HMRC data, which would give us a lot of information, which would help us know who's where, who's moved, and so on. We're starting to use HESA data to try and understand students better, because they're a really difficult group to capture, and their moves as well. Data linkage is another area we're looking at. If we can link data you know, in a safe environment, taking account of all the privacy aspects. That allows us to do a lot more analysis as well and to try and determine where the moves are and characteristics of people. So there's a lot of work going on in the background to improve the data sources, but it does take time, you know, just to try and get access to data and then go through all the privacy panels and that sort of thing.
Right. Did you want to come in on that point?
Don't really need a list because we know what the shortages are because these are the jobs that the immigrants are taking, and that's been pretty stable over the last, ever since, you know, we had data that we could look at. So we know, and I just want to come back to this. This is a very important thing because we know we're going to need more healthcare workers in the future, more doctors, more nurses, because the population is aging. We're going to have very slow growth, if not reduction, in young people, so we're not going to be able to train them up to do this. So you have to make a decision. So what they did in Canada, for example, there was 2 types of nurses, you'll know this. A nurse is a higher education degree, a nursing assistant is a college degree, right? They don't generate nursing assistants anymore. They stopped training young Canadians up as nursing assistants, and they come from abroad. And they are a special category within the immigration system. So it's, if you have a shortage, the hospitals indicate this, and then the immigration system reacts. And that's, you know, that's a political decision about what you're going to teach young people. And, you know, this is old news, as Christine says, and, you know, it's a political issue about whether you want to share policy between 2 levels of government or not. The technology is there, it's been proven, it's been in place in Australia and Canada for a long time. Sure, there's problems with it, it may not work perfectly, but, you know, it seems to work and they've expanded it. And there's 2 ways of doing it. One is you completely devolve immigration. The other is you share it with, for example, provincial nominee programs and things like this. It's just a matter of agreement. It's not a matter of any difficulty or technology, and it seems to work. And now every single province in Canada and the 3 territories have these arrangements with the government. So, you know, the federal government. So it's workable, but it's the political issue.
Okay, I'm just going to bring in Lewis MacDonald.
Thanks very much. There was I wanted, before we move towards conclusions, I wanted to come back to a wider question around migration from the European Union, because we've talked a lot about Poland and Polish workers, quite rightly, because they are by far the largest group. But if you take Polish workers out of the picture, then there are twice as many people from the original or from the EU14 as there are from the other accession countries. And Christina Boswell made a brief reference to migrants from Southern Europe as a result of austerity policies in those countries. But I wonder if there's anything else we should understand about what's clearly quite a substantial part of the migrant population which is not coming from Central and Eastern Europe and appears from the facts that have been put in front of us to have a different pattern of qualification and employment from the Polish example that we've been talking about. I wonder if there's anyone who would want to say anything about that population.
There's very little research to date, unless other members of the panel might correct me. I think there's very little research to date on the profile of EU15 migrants, and particularly those from Southern European countries affected by austerity. I think we can say, based on experience of previous flows, there's typically, and this is a stylized model, but there's typically what's often called a kind of inverted U shape in trends in migration from particular areas. So typically you start with pioneer migrants who might be self-selected because they have good language skills or are confident in being able to manage well in a new environment, and then once they've established themselves, typically there's a so-called herd effect, apologies for the jargon here, whereby others, nationals or people from similar locales might follow them, thinking, well, that's, there are opportunities in that country, and then you see a kind of increase in migration flows between particular locales, and then over time there's a kind of saturation effect whereby it then becomes less attractive. Now this, this is a typical kind of model of how an evolution of a migration system between different places. Obviously this is highly stylized, it's ideal, typical, etc. But arguably we are seeing something a little bit like that in relation to A8 immigration. So there's been a substantial rise in immigration from the A8 accession countries since 2004. I think with Romanian and Bulgarian, the A2 immigration flows, we're still seeing a rise, but I think the populations of those countries are not so substantial that we will see an indefinite rise. I think we probably will see some petering out to some extent. And with the southern European countries, that now comprises about half of all EU immigration flows to the UK, so that's quite substantial. It might well rise in the next few years, but then over the longer term, I think we can assume that as those economies pick up in the next 5 to 10 years, again, we will see an ebbing of that flow of migration. And I suspect that, within the next, 10 or so years, we will see a return of levels of intra-EU migration to, in a sense, normality. So EU mobility, freedom of movement, was never intended to comprise substantial flows from poorer to richer regions. It was meant to be a kind of partnership of, broadly speaking, of equals, where income disparities were not significant enough to generate large-scale flows. And I suspect we will eventually return to that kind of scenario. But for the moment, I do think the EU15, especially those from southern countries, are likely to remain a significant portion of immigration to the UK. But that's very general terms, and there may well be empirical research which could underpin some of these general claims.
Angela Hallam.
I just wanted to stress that the impacts review, which looked at the impacts of migrants and migration, found that almost all the recent evidence is on the migrants from the accession countries. But if we look at the sort of characteristics of migrants from the census, if you're thinking that if you're dividing the EEA recent and EEA established and looking at the EEA established to get a better idea of that group, they're much more similar to other populations in terms of employment patterns, age, qualifications, and experience. It's the recent migrants that are different.
I think it's the point that struck me was that the annual population survey figures suggested that migrants from the EU14 tended to be older, they tended to be more likely to be in education and health, and much less likely to be in agriculture and hotels, and their employment rates differed as well. So and I think Christina Boswell's point about the difference between normal and abnormal flows of migration perhaps is relevant here. And I'd be interested in comments on that.
I also wanted to make the point that actually housing tenure is different. People who've been here longer are much more likely to be owner-occupiers, and less likely to be private rented.
The questions I thought was important to ask on the record. Clearly, quite a number of EU migrants, particularly people who've migrated earlier and from longer established EU countries, have applied and obtained permanent residence status in the UK, and I just wanted to confirm that if there's any view on that. I presume that permanent residence status, once granted, cannot be revoked, but I just wanted to confirm with witnesses that that is indeed the case, given the questions that have been asked about people feeling welcome and feeling secure who are here.
We haven't seen a great rush for people applying for permanent residency. There has been a few, and there has been a few that have come and asked questions about how it's done and all the rest, but I mean, there hasn't been a stampede or anything like that, and that's my experience anyway. And the same with, sorry, I lost the track. No, but we haven't seen any rush now.
Okay.
That's all right.
There's going to have to be a cutoff date somewhere along the way, isn't there? We're going to have to say, well, after this date, the free movement stops. So that's when you're going to get your spurt, when that's announced. Yeah. So it's very important. I mean, in economics, we fixate on this about how you announce and when you announce, right? So this will be the big rush. But so one day before, one day after, there's going to be some difference. And this is where you're going to get this happen, right? And it's going to be, I think it'll be pretty big, but it'll be one-off. So it'll be a bulge, right? And indeed, I mean, I'm from Canada, my mother's English, so I had right of abode here, but I became a British citizen because they can change the rules anytime they like, basically. And, it concerned me. because my career was here, so I became a British citizen. So I think you're going to see this, but it only will occur once the announcement is made, Brexit is going to happen, blah, 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 clause 50, and there's a date where you can't come, work, and live here as you could before if you're from an EU country, if that's what happens.
Did you want to go back in?
No,
sorry, Rachel.
I just want to make a point that I think it's important that we give the same respect to UK nationals working in the EU, and we haven't mentioned that today, but you know, their acquired rights are just as important as anyone that's coming here, and it hasn't been mentioned today. So it was sort of, I wondered if anyone wanted to make a comment on that point.
That's something we're looking at in detail next week, the acquired rights. Obviously, the experts here are people who are experts in migration into the UK. But, I mean, if anybody wants to come in and comment on that, that's fine. Stuart McMillan, did you have some questions you wanted to?
Yes, it's just, I mean, some of it has been touched upon, but I'd just like to take it on a bit further. And that's just in terms of the costs of providing services to migrants who have came here. Is there a feeling within the panel that that the costs have either far outweighed the benefits of migrants coming, or actually there are benefits of migrants coming which has actually far outweighed the costs of the migrants coming to Scotland and the UK?
I think that's. I think the benefits certainly outweigh the costs. The migrants who are coming to Scotland they're young, they're healthy, they're wanting to be in employment, and obviously there's a lot of evidence that shows that. And their use of health service is low because they're young, they're healthy. I mean, I think evidence suggests that the longer that they stay in Scotland, the more likely they are to become more like the Scottish population, and in terms of public health, as their eating habits and use of alcohol changes, there may be, but certainly they're young, they're taking jobs, they're integrating, and then there's quite a lot of evidence that they're not a strain on public services. I mean, obviously, the education services are needing to change to adapt to language provision in schools, and there's some evidence on that. But there's no link. There's no clear link between migration and crime, for example. So yes, the benefits certainly outweigh the costs. There's very good evidence for that, and I think all my colleagues would agree.
Lorraine Cook from COSLA.
I would have to say the feedback we're getting from local authorities, I would agree with Angela very much. As I said earlier, we responded to the Migration Advisory Committee, and it was impacts on services, and what we were getting was overwhelmingly positive. The only caveat was English is an additional language, but it was very much that there's this, but look at the benefits that people are bringing to the area as well.
Angela Hallam.
There's also some evidence to suggest that that children in schools benefit from having pupils in the schools alongside them who are English as an additional language. So.
On that latter point, I mean, my own thoughts on the issue in terms of education is that with the curriculum for excellence that we do have in Scotland, and trying to make and allow younger people to be more rounded individuals and more understanding of issues that are taking place, then surely inward migration is going to be that benefit, and is also going to help with the teaching of through the CFE.
Yes, okay.
Also, just to add, from a small piece of research I did several years back in collaboration with COSLA in Glasgow, there was a strong feeling amongst education authorities that having pupils from elsewhere around the world in classes, particularly in areas of multiple deprivation where Scottish-born children might have fairly limited experience of life beyond their beyond Glasgow, never mind, you know, in the wider world, that having pupils from elsewhere, it's assisted with aspirations and possibilities for Scottish-born children as well.
Robert Wright.
This is obviously a very important issue, but you know, there's a lot of misinformation about this. But there was a huge study done at UCL that actually showed the opposite of what you're suggesting. In fact, immigrants pay much more into the system than they take out, much more. And it kind of makes sense even at a simple level, because most immigrants are young and they're working. So is a Scottish young person who's working getting more, putting in more to the system than they're taking out? No, then why would an immigrant be? And the thing is, the fertility rates are, you know, okay, between the Scottish population and the, you know, the Polish population is not the statistic, because the people are younger here, so they're having more children. So this is why you get, you know, sort of maybe some extra demand for some education services or whatever. But there's no evidence of this, that somehow they're stealing jobs from Scots or they're, you know, sponging on the welfare state. In fact, it's the opposite by a significant margin if you believe this research. And that's another, you know, in the end of the day, it's another reason to say that immigrants are very important economically because of this. So the rhetoric that we get from the anti-immigration lobby is the actual opposite of what some of the research says, and this is very good stuff.
Supplementary from Emma Harper. Sorry.
Just a quick clarification, really, because I think Rebecca Kay mentioned it earlier. One of the National Farmers Union guys said to me on Monday night, why can't we just train our own to be dairymen? And I think the answer is nobody wants to do that, so that's why we need our immigrants, whatever country they come from, to be our dairymen. Is that correct?
Found employers, even some employers in Angus, saying that they'd made a deliberate attempt to recruit local people to offer training packages for local people and so on, and there was no uptake. So that would concur with that.
Okay.
That there are some jobs where local people, even if there's unemployment in the area, even if there's a need for employment amongst young people in the area, there's some jobs they're not going to take up.
Okay, thanks.
Professor Boswell.
Phenomenon of labour market mismatch, and it can be a result of a mismatch of skills, a mismatch of preferences, or a mismatch of locations. So it might just be that these are remote areas where people don't want to relocate for employment, even if they are currently unemployed. So this is a known problem. I mean, I had perhaps if we're drawing to a, I mean, I wanted to make a wider point going back to the issue of public opinion and the politics of immigration in Scotland, if I may.
Yes, please.
So, I mean, I have a sense that, you know, obviously we've seen very recently in the, you know, the climate and the debate around immigration in the rest of the UK in particular, in the context of the Brexit debate, has been very highly charged, very heated. And I think there are both risks and opportunities for the Scottish debate when we look at that, when we observe what's happened in the rest of the UK. So I think the risk is, I don't think we should be complacent that Scottish public opinion is so, you know, significantly different from the rest of the UK. And I think, you know, in the event of a Scottish government making a case for a slightly distinct or perhaps more liberal approach from then the rest of the UK, there are risks that immigration could become more politically salient in Scotland than it is at the moment. And there's also the permanent risk that it could be an object of party political mobilisation. So, you know, we know that there is a constant temptation for centre-right and populist right parties to mobilise on anti-immigrant platforms. So I think, you know, that could be a scenario in Scotland, and I think we have to think seriously about how we can engender, foster a more responsible and well-informed debate on immigration in Scotland. And I think one part of that has to be trying to secure some kind of buy-in across the political spectrum in Scotland for a shared and progressive vision on immigration in Scotland, and one that's informed by evidence about immigration. And I know there is a kind of anti-expert, post-truth kind of dynamic at the moment in the context of immigration debates, and we have to think very carefully about that. But I do think there's a real opportunity right now, there's a window of opportunity for Scotland to do things differently and to have a more progressive, informed and open debate on this issue.
Colin Wilson, you're nodding at that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that what you're saying is happening now. That's where we are, that's why we feel, that's why the feeling is out there from migrants that Scotland is a good place to be, because of the, you know, we're not anti-immigrant. We have the open debate about it, and we always talk about the positive aspects of migration rather than the negatives.
Professor Kay?
I would agree with that, but I think that to pick up on what Christina's saying, to me it seems there's a really important need to have that informed, evidence-based, progressive, popular debate with the settled population. So there's the political leadership, and migrants look to that and see that. We can't ignore the fact that there are large numbers of people within the Scottish population that don't necessarily share those progressive views, don't necessarily express them on a day-to-day basis in their interactions with migrants, and that could shift quite quickly.
Research at the moment on education and Five Migrants Forum, and one of the things that we're seeing is that in schools where there's a large migrant population, there seems to be a tipping point in which mainstream parents feel that the ethos and culture of the school has been taken away from them. And I think this is something that we've got to be very, very careful about. And as somebody said to me about migration as a whole, hasn't, and other parts of the UK, it's reached that tipping point. And that's why you see much more negativity in the rest of the UK. Scotland, for the most part, hasn't reached that tipping point yet. So I think we've got to be very, very careful and just watch what we're doing and sort of carry on as we are. And
but I think that would fit precisely into the idea of this being a moment of opportunity, because it doesn't have to be a tipping point. And I don't think it always is a tipping point in other parts of the UK. I think if you look at London and the way that it has acted as an exception, where London has the highest possible levels of migration, diversity, and so on, and that it's often in the neighbouring regions where there's lower levels of migration that people are most prone to believe anti-migration rhetoric, then that's also a danger for Scotland, that we actually have regions with a relatively low number of migrants, a relatively low lived experience of what that means, but vulnerable to the negative discourses that say they're going to come, and this is what will be the outcomes of that.
Angela Hallam?
Yes, I just wanted to echo what everyone's been saying about this time being one of opportunity, but the caveat that we do need to remember that attitudes are not fixed and that they can change really quickly, and we should avoid complacency. I mean, there is some evidence that greater exposure to migrants actually increases tolerance and understanding, but if people feel overwhelmed, you've got a very fine line there. So
I think that's a good point to end on. And I'd like to thank all the witnesses for coming. We're over time, and I know that you've got other places to be. So thank you very much for coming and contributing today. And I will now bring the session to a close and go into private session.